So as I said, I wanted to put out videos focused on tackling one concept at a time. So why not start with the mother lode of all concepts? God. This is not a pitch for there is a God or there isn't a God. Not a pitch pro atheism. Not a pitch pro religion. I wanted to explore how religion may or may not be embedded in our thinking. Full disclosure, I've my own upbringing. I was raised in a communist country, and I was very much encouraged to be an atheist. I wasn't raised an atheist. My family wasn't terribly religious, but I guess they would consider themselves Christian. The tradition in Romania called Romanian Orthodox, which is sort of a derivation of Greek Orthodox. So church rituals, I like to think of it as Catholic light. We don't go as often, and our confessionals are basically, we don't actually have to open our mouth and say anything. You just kind of go to church and go, I sinned, get blessed, and go away. Tells you just how much depth I've got in ritual of the Orthodox Christianity. But in culture, because this was very much in the heyday of sort of the communism, like socialist theology, all that stuff, communists tended to treat, at least, the teachers and all of the education that was being spoon-fed to us, there was a bit of disdain if you were religious. You're a little slow, you're a little backward, you haven't caught up with the rest. Stuff is for savages type of thing. And what was interesting is that when I emigrated, I came to the States. I actually connected with other people from Romania, and they were all very much and not only religious but devout Baptist. So I think Southern Baptists are crazy. These guys were religious. They were so intense. I just remember that, like, the way they would speak to you, because there would always be some sort of pitch to convert you, save your soul. They were so convinced that they weren't convincing me. But I remember having this feeling of, like, I wish I could believe anything as strong as these guys seem to believe in this. I mean, to me, that just seemed like, oh, that could just take away a whole lot of doubt. But it didn't bring for me. But that was probably just the question of maturity. Didn't really give it much thought. And as sort of YouTube came around and, it more and more of the video library of the world became available, I started to watch more and more debates and, intellectual dialogue, things like that. And by far, I would say my favorite debater of all time, especially when it comes to this topic, is Christopher Hitchens. I mean, the man had an amazing command of the English language. He was very witty. He could always turn a phrase. He was quick on his feet. He never gave quarter. He never gave an inch. And especially when opponents were poorly prepared. I mean, that was just amazing to watch, just trouncing right, left, and center. And the thing is, he demanded respect from even the most, devout. I mean, he had quite a number of friends that were cardinals and bishops and whatnot. There was many of his debates were actually deeply interesting. They weren't just sort of fodder for, capping on culture. But there was something there that as much as he was more eloquent, as much as he was much more informed, much more cutting, much more incising, there was a carve out that he tended to leave. So whenever there would always be the typical counter argument, there's no way to find out what you ought to. And he said, that there's really there's no reason to be religious to appreciate the numinous. And then he would go off on a tirade about how he is moved by a place like a Notre Dame or classic Christian architecture, classic Christian composers, literatures. These things move him. They are deeply, the divine permeates through them, and numinous. Numinous was his phrase, which was a strange thing because it seemed like he was divorcing the concept. Because to me, it seemed that all of the arguments that he would ever field were against the book, whatever phrasing in the book, whatever advice the book gave, or whatever actions people following the book had undertaken, horrible this or that or whomever. It was always never quite on target. And that always irked at me. Now, as he began to grow sick, got cancer, sort of began to pass the torch. I think Sam Harris emerges, I guess, the person who would take the baton from him. And Sam Harris, too, is a greatly intelligent guy, very articulate, very articulate. I would put him up against any of the English debaters. Deep thinker, but yet he also had a carve out, and he tried to tackle the question a little bit more directly. He would he did at least have some arguments as to understanding where morality comes from, and his basis was that we could discover suffering, and from suffering, then we know what to avoid. We know that we can make the world worse, which begins to get at the argument. But he would also have a carve out, and his was a little bit more spirituality, the idea of mindfulness, meditation, more Eastern tradition type stuff. But it seemed to me like both of them had left that, whatever that indefinable is, left it untouched. And then I came across Jordan Peterson, and his, I think, was the most modest of all explanations. The response was basically, I try to behave as if God exists. And the first time I heard it, he just said that, and it kind of seemed like, oh, that's a cop-out. That's kind of like Pascal's wager, right? It's you believe what because you think he might exist and he punishes you kind of thing. But it wasn't what he meant. And then in other discussions that watched, he went quite a bit more depth. And the message was a positive one. It was, you can look at religion, and you should have the ability to pick out just the good stuff and follow the good stuff. You don't have to basically be critical of it. You can think of it as the distillation of whatever behaviors man has been exposed to over time, and pull out of those that have most meaning to you and follow them. And that seemed to me the most constructive, the most affirmative advice, because it had a proper upside. Not doing it would be to give to your baser instincts, to in effect, contribute to the destruction of the world, not to the construction of the world, which didn't seem that appealing. Yet, doing this, even though it might be perhaps, putting your shoulder to some weight, taking on responsibility, things of that nature. I mean, these are all platitudes to a certain extent, but they were much more in line with the idea that there is a duty, and it isn't just you that you have to answer to. There is a greater schema, there is a greater something, and you owe it to that greater whatever to do your part. And I think that's what was missing out of all of the polemics around pro-atheist polemics. Because the atheist will tend to just cut things apart, but doesn't necessarily provide a replacement. So this was really, I think, the gist of what Nietzsche was. God is dead, but he didn't say it triumphantly. We'll talk about that in a bit. But aside from what my impression of those philosophers and psychologists were, my own thinking. I mean, I've been thinking about this for a while, much more so recently, but I can see a very logical, straight path from the idea of the conscious monkey, whoever we were, being able to jump to the concept of animism. You're alive, the animal you hunt is alive, spirit, you see the life leaving it, there must be a spark of life, so all of a sudden, the idea of animism can easily get to you. I can also see a path to deism. You build your hut, you build your spear, you look around the world, somebody must have built all this, man, he must be really powerful. You can see the idea of a creator, of a supernatural being, right? Anything that interferes with your daily activities, embodied. I can even see a migration from deism to sort of this personal relationship idea. In is, you can imagine being in a an especially vicious thunderstorm or rock slide or something where many of your tribes die, and you completely have no agency, cannot control anything. You're just at the mercy of nature, of the universe, and you survive. I can see how that one would be. Well, creator can give and take life. For some reason, he let me live. So gee, I must be special. He must like me. So I can see where you can even get to that personal relation, right? But all of that is sort of tenuous steps. At the same time, I'm not quite as gung-ho about the organized religion as Peterson is, because as much as there is a lot of wisdom in the wisdom literature, you can see that religion has been, there's a lot of illogical aspects to it. It seems that there's a lot more description around behavior and controlling behavior. And you can see how that was used as a tool to, in effect, keep you placid, controlled, keep you behaving the right way. And if you look at history, the majority of our clergy, especially, higher you got to open type of offices, corruption was horrendous. Even today, Catholic Church, the nightmares that we keep hearing out of it. So I can see people being very dejected with organized religion of any kind. Islam was Hitchens's last, whipping horse, but there's lots of aspects of Islam that are severely challenging. I'm sure I don't know much about Judaism, but I'm sure that there are some there too. Probably the trick is having enough many thousands of years from its generation that you now feel more and more empowered to step away from some of the bad things and only take on the good things. But there is very much an ideology there. Ideologies are basically there to control. I find it interesting how the very same exact roles seen in the evolution of historical organized religion exists now in sort of the intersectional movement. But I'll save that for another. But I thought, okay, if you look at the contemplative traditions, now that's a little bit different. And I'm talking about the Buddhism or Jainism, things that are more predicated on you observing the world, being mindful, and really taking in, meditating, taking in deep thought. They tend to have a vector, right? With Buddhism, you tend to be more inward focused, finding your inner self, stilling the outside, reaching that inner peace, at which point you sort of disconnect from being human and you can be in balance with the world. Jainism doesn't quite have that same same idea, because it involves the idea of dharma and karma and all of that, and samsara. So you have to be more mindful of the heavens, maybe more focused outwards. But I think the simplest one is if you look at the shamanistic practices. So these, you basically, using a plant, you induce a state of trance. And if you happen to be on one side of the world where ayahuasca is poison, then your trances will tend to focus on drifting outwards, going beyond where you are, beyond the planet, going out and connecting with creation. There is always a border, a marginal, there's a marginal state that you go through. Some people see it as a door, some people see it as a flower, some people see it as whatever. But it's always something you go beyond, and then you cease to be human. You connect to something else. Complete opposite, however, if you happen to be the Boga shaman, practice in Africa. Those are more to go inwards. And this is where I think comes the fundamental difference. And I think I'm very much convinced that it's sort of like the unsigned infinity, it's a circle that loops on itself. But I think one concept is a little bit easier to grasp for most humans, and another one is tougher. Because inward is also an infinity, the infinity of zero. Much like, a number reaching zero, having to infinitely grow smaller and smaller and smaller, never quite reaching zero. There is an infinity there, but it's tougher to put your finger on it. Whereas when you're looking at vastness, that it's easy to appreciate the infinity of, infinity. That just somehow tends to sit easier, I think, in the human mind. Well, that's the contemplative religion. Then, of course, in the age of reason, we got rationalism. Rationalism was the promise that there would be some morality that comes out of just reason. And we've been waiting. And this, as I was saying before, this was Nietzsche's death of God, the death of God warning, which was not done triumphantly. I think as he said that God is dead and all the water in the world will not wash the blood away. This was his warning that humanity was approaching a moment where they would no longer have a morality moored in the practices of faith, left with their own devices, and very much feared that. And it turned out that he was correct. I mean, exactly as he predicted it, we ended up having one of the most brutal wars in our history. Two of them. In any case, I guess the question would be, what is easier for the human mind to accept? The outwardly expansion, the transcendent, the being connected to something that is just out there, bigger, or to something that is inside of us, deeply, focused forever inside? My bet is that outward is here. And I think it's also the prevalent thread in religions, of today's religion. With the exception, like I said, of Buddhism and some shamanistic ones, I think it's much easier to, if you consider yourself to be connected to anything, divine, numinous, holy, whatever, much easier to say that you're part of that creation, that which is immense. Now, again, I'm not an argument for God. This is just that feeling you have inside where you don't really know. You kind of think that you're accountable to someone, maybe not just yourself. Maybe you should do better. That the place where your morality comes from, that is as yet undefined. If it comes from you, then it comes from you. If you believe it comes from elsewhere, you might be wrong. But if that is your belief, and if that belief is connected with elsewhere being something awe-inspiring, something divine, something numinous, then it confers a different value on that, because whatever your hardship is, you aren't really allowed to fail completely. You may fail, but you're answerable to something of a higher authority, and you can't shake it, right? Which means that there's just a little bit of difference in terms of when you give up. We'll touch on that. Another way to explain it, I think math has been our main go-to science, and I've done an amazing job of mapping our known reality. We have some ideas, and whenever we don't grasp something very well, we tend to turn to math, and we're pretty good at creating symbols for concepts that we don't exactly have a full handle on. We understand limit cases that are boundaries of our knowledge, for example. So for all of math, we have the idea of defined numbers and have the concept of undefined. And we know that we know how to put border limits on how an equation will work within this universe, but it will not work. It'll break once you move into that universe. And we even have some conceptual primitives for the unbounded concepts. So zero, for example, it's a pretty complex idea, but we have a symbolistic representation for it. Infinity is another. We also have the idea of getting there but not quite touching, right? The idea of being asymptotically close, meaning ever so close but never touching. So the idea of being of something but not quite understanding and not fully grasping it is something we can represent. We've even gone further than that, because we also have we kind of scoured the space of even trying to bring these things into operation. So we know that, for example, a division by zero or a breaks logic. A division by infinity breaches some level of zero. It breaches another sort of boundary. And we have something called indeterminate forms, which in effect just become completely nonsensical, like 0 times infinity. So we do have some yardsticks, some holes in the ground that we've stuck here and there to sort of help our reconnoitering in uncharted spaces. So This seems to me is the simplest way to define something that is infinitely inward, for example. It's greater than zero, but infinitely close. In any case, that may help, that may not. The way my fragmented mind works. Let's go through a little exercise about if you've come from most religions, one of the persistent concepts is that, hey, you have free will. Now, of course, there's all of this other neurological stuff that speaks against it. I'll make a video on that too, because I think there's something a little deeper there. But is agency where your value comes from? I mean, you would think so, right? If you're a free agent, then that means you have the ability to make choices. So you can make the choice to help, you can make the choice to destroy. So you have some agency, you have some value. But let's kind of break that down. We always assume that the individual has agency. If someone does something, we assume that it was their will to do so. So we sort of break it down in terms of intent and then the action and the result of the action. But if you do something and it's beneficial, you tend to get the credit for it. And if you do something and it's damaging, you tend to get the blame or the punishment for it. It is you that has caused it. It was your intention. Then we begin to have these exception cases. So for example, if somebody's mentally impaired, we consider that he's lost some of his agency, right? He didn't know better. So we don't want to punish them as severely or as often or even punish them at all. There's also certain scenario type cases where soldier shooting an enemy combatant, we know that killing a person is wrong, but the soldier can do so because his agency is sort of on loan to the greater authority, sovereign authority that has given him what? Something external to him, but it's an independent morality, right? It is right for you to kill the enemy combatant because of whatever reason. And we accept that. And we also have a limit on that too. We tend to think of legitimacy. We look at same combatant, the same soldier is now a terrorist. He's working for some illegitimate state. We don't give them the same freedom. If he's working in a gang, he may have his own ethos, his own morality, whatever, but we don't find that as being legitimate or valid. That's a strange thing. But if you go back to the insane person, he isn't aware. He doesn't know better. Aware of what? Aware of the underlying morality? So we have an expectation that there should be a morality out there that people should strive for. I mean, in some cases, it's law, right? Everyone should be familiar with law. But he gets a little dicey, because let's go to the example of the soldier. He has full agency. He looks at the enemy combatant. He shoots him. He's allowed to. But yet we have cases in our history where we said, no. There are certain events, certain things that are so heinous, so beyond the pale, that you are supposed to defy orders. So such would be the Nuremberg trials, where the defense, if I was just following orders, simply was not enough. It was just beyond the pale. So there is an idea embedded in there that morality transcends even morality as we know it. There's supposed to be some sort of hard stop that you hit, that you go, no, I can't go beyond that. People that are pacifists would often, incite, I can't do that, I can't, take another life, or it seems that whatever your core beliefs are, they tend to manifest themselves in space. And usually they tend to be connected to a religion, but not always. So we see that an agency can be given away and can be taken away. So again, it comes back from this thing of this transcendent or immanent. Is the value of you coming from you or coming from outside of you? This was, I think, the place where this fork in the road kind of manifested itself, and then it manifested itself into governments. And I think the two best examples would be Voltaire and Rousseau, because they lived around the same time, roughly. They believed, they lived in the same environments. They kind of believed in, I would say, the same higher values, but a little bit differently. Whereas Voltaire he wasn't necessarily a multiculturalist, but he definitely explored other cultures. He was very interested and curious, and had a bit of reverence for the achievements of man. Explored Chinese culture, explored Arab culture, was critical of Arabs, but he had quite a broad range of appreciation of culture. And he very much came from the perspective of the humanist, the value being in the man, and how whatever he wanted to help his fellow man, it was because man had value. Whereas Rousseau looked at the state as being the primary player. He was a collectivist. He didn't so much see as rights being attributable to a man because they just innately are in a man, because his argument was quite a pragmatic one. What rights can you have if the state isn't there to defend them for you? Right? And that, although that is completely logically valid, it completely changes the way you begin to execute, for example, a Bill of Rights. And we see that very much in what happens in America's Revolution versus France's Revolution, where rights are basically endowed, they're inalienable, versus expressly given to you by the state. So that's really where this begins to separate. And I think in its most diametrically opposed examples would be the typical communist state, and what is the sole surviving state of that concept of humanism, America. And it's, how does the state see you? So does the state value you, or do you value the state? What is the primary, if one of these two concepts has to win, how you fall into that will influence a great many decisions, what you're willing to accept and what you're not willing to. So in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, and just sort of the founding values, the American state was built on the idea that you had transcendent value. There was just it was these rights, these values, these things were given to you by the Creator. No one could take them away. The state's job was to protect them for you, to help you protect them. They weren't there to be taken away or given to you by the state. The state was you and others collectively being able to protect those rights that God had given you. On the flip side, the French Declaration, the German National Socialists, the Italian Fascists, the Russian Communists, all their view was more around, you have value to the state because you can be put to value. And it is the state that confers upon you all of these rights. Therefore, it is your job to function as part of the state. And it's interesting how things invert here, because when you look at the typical view of man, the traditional American view is that man is fallible. He's fundamentally breakable, corruptible. He isn't perfect. He needs to be watched. Yes, we should appreciate virtue when it is present. We should cultivate virtue in man, but man is fallible. So you see lots of checks and balances being built in the system, and although there is value to the man, proof must be brought, right? So you're innocent until proven guilty, right? But there is proof. There is a process in which you will go to, things will be found out. On the flip side, if you look at most of the Marxist sort of line of thinking, what makes a person good is their oppression. Right? If they've been oppressed, all of a sudden there really isn't much expressed around the idea that what is the morality of man. It's all expressed in function of the state. Your job into the state. So whatever degree of fitness you have to the state, then your value is there. That's a little bit different. That's not quite as enduring. I think in closing, my point is pretty much a simple one. Everything we do in life continuously shows us and reinforces what it shows us, namely that man is fallible. We will fail at some point. Every man fails, every woman fails, we will fail. I will fail, you will. At some point, your morality will fail you. And the idea is, when our morality fails us, this is something that, for example, you see in heroin addicts. Those that have already beaten down their willpower, and if they fall off the wagon, they beat themselves up. Oh, you're a loser. You you have no worth. Therefore, that makes it that much easier to fall in again. Whereas if your value is transcendent, it's not just from you, but it's elsewhere, then when you fail, I mean, you do the same things. You chastise yourself. You how dare you do this? But the difference is you're responsible to another authority. So it isn't that you judge yourself. It is that you judge yourself because you know that there's also someone judging you above. And so you dust yourself off and you say, you better do better next time. But it gives you this idea of continuation because you're not done. You're answerable to something else. If you, however, if you're sort of an inward person and if all of your strength comes from you, well, then at that point, all of your strength has failed you, right? Because you are the sum of your strength. So when you pick yourself up from the ground and you're beating yourself up and you say you're worthless, what you're doing is you're habituating a future failure. So I guess that's the idea, that eventually when you fall down, it's what you reach for next. Do you reach for this undefinable, poorly understood idea that connects you to something stronger? Or do you reach for nothing? That, I think, is fundamentally what is the gist of difference between sort of conservative religious, liberal atheist sort of thing. And I think that if you accept that, then you'll find that actually, it's a tiny little difference with a world of distinction. It amplifies almost all of your views vis-a-vis the world. So all of a sudden, here's simple questions like, are people valuable or disposable? Well, if they have this transcendent value, they can never be disposable, no matter how damaged, no matter how awful they've behaved or whatever. So this commands you to engage in dialogue because they can't be all bad, right? But if they're disposable, you can very much discard them because they don't know what they're talking about. Is the world worthwhile, or should we start over? That's a question you hear quite often today, and the idea of cancel culture and the awful Western patriarchy, all of that. Well, if the world is inhabited by people that have a value, then what they've built must have had a value, right? It can't be completely bad, so you're always left, the default stance can never be to replace it, it would have to be to fix it. And then more broadly, is the world in order or is it in chaos? And if you believe that there is, a few billion of these little sparks floating around, then there must be some kind of order. It can't be chaos. Also, you look at your own personal approach to situations. Your default stance to be cooperative or to be conflictual? Are you in order or are you in chaos? And most importantly, do you seek order or do you seek chaos? And I think, depending on which side of the spectrum you fall on, one may be of more attraction to the other. I know what attracts me. So I think this begins, for me at least, to define at least one of the differences between what we traditionally call empty terms, the right and the left. I'll get into those two in other videos. But this one was for divinity, God, or whatever. Comment if you liked it.